America, the land of the free and the home of the whopper. A country where the incoming president casually throws out a hilarious joke about annexing its neighbor to the north at a dinner party at a resort for billionaires and the elite. Clearly, it was a very funny joke, right? Right? But as a Canadian, I feel like it's my responsibility to present an olive branch and bring unity between our two nations. I mean, we do have a lot in common. You vote in your first black president, we then vote in our first black prime minister. You start clearly legitimate wars because of weapons of mass destruction. We also start wars because of alleged weapons of mass destruction. You win a Stanley Cup? Actually, let's not really talk about that one. That one still hurts. Regardless, Trump talking about annexing Canada got me thinking, could this actually happen? And how close have we come to this actually happening before? I mean, let's be real. Our American neighbors have been staring longingly across the border for centuries, muttering, "All that land and so few people, why not? It is our manifest destiny." But let's get something straight. If the USA ever did decide to invade Canada, it would be the geopolitical equivalent of John Jones fighting Eugene Levy wearing snowshoes. Sure, Canada has a lot of pride, but their defense strategy mostly revolves around polite emails and hoping that NATO returns their calls. Before we get into the logistics of America turning every Tim Hortons into a Freedom Hortons barbecue with guns, let's take a stroll down history lane to look at all the times that the USA has tried to do this before. In 1812, America was feeling spicy after the Revolutionary War win and decided to say, hey, let's add Canada to the roster. The logic? It's barely defended, and they probably want to join us anyway. As America never has any problems and only does good things for its citizens, so why wouldn't Canada want to join? Anyways, American forces tried to invade multiple times, only to be met by British soldiers, Indigenous warriors, Canadian militia, and something so terrifying that many American soldiers had never experienced before. And that was Canadian winters. You see, many American soldiers became casualties because they weren't used to the horrific daily life of just living in southern Ontario. But when it was all over, Canada fought them to a standstill and even managed to burn down the White House in 1814, making this the first in a long line of future wars that America would start and lose or draw. Later in the 19th century, America was on another land-grabbing spree trying to manifest their destiny, basically the idea that they were destined to own everything from sea to shining sea. An idea which, if it were to happen today, would be viewed similar to a lot of authoritarian rhetoric, ranging from modern-day China to Soviet Union communism in the 20th century. But it's America, and they did it with guns and freedom, so it was amazing and not tyrannical, obviously. Fast forward to 1859 when a pig caused a standoff between the USA and British Canada. An American farmer saw that a Canadian pig was eating all of his potatoes in his garden. So the American shot and killed the pig. The American said, "It was eating my potatoes." And the Canadian replied, "It is up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig." The British-Canadian authorities tried to arrest the American. The American military protected the American, and within a few days, warships and thousands of military personnel arrived, waiting for the start of a new war. But the war never came. This was one of the handful of times a war nearly started because of the death of an animal, or what I like to call them, John Wick wars. The last time that I know that a war was almost started because of an animal was a Greek dog crossing the Bulgarian border in 1925 that potentially could have kicked off an entire Balkan region war before World War II. But anyways, in 1866, Americans had plans to annex Canada, but they got distracted by an epic shouting match over whether cotton or human rights was more important, aka the Civil War. A year later, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, and by the late 1800s, when the gold rush was happening in the Yukon and Alaska, America was kinda like, hey, you know what? We need more oceanfront properties and ports up north for all of our new land. So we own the coastline now. Fight us if you want. And well, no fight happened, and America won the negotiations leading to the modern border we have today. But now America was everywhere. It was to the south of Canada, to the west of Canada, it was under Canadian beds. In fact, that feeling someone is watching you while you are alone in your room, you got it, that's America. But oddly enough, apart from a few occasional political spats, Canada and the USA have had pretty good relations for the past 120 years or so. Up until, recently. And well, we fast forward to modern times, and Canada's battles with America are less about muskets and more about milk and trees. For years, the USA has accused Canada of unfairly subsidizing Canada's dairy and lumber industries. In retaliation, they slapped tariffs on Canada, and that was in 2018. Now, this wasn't great for relations, but it was also a big improvement from relations compared to burning down the White House or starting a war over a pig. But then recently, Donald Trump announced a 25% tariff on virtually all Canadian goods, citing an unfair trade relationship and that Canadian companies are undercutting American ones. The trouble is, Canadian goods are often more expensive than American ones, and trust me, if you're Canadian, you would know this because everything is more expensive here. The food, the real estate, the resources, the podcast that our emperor produces for $1 million that gets a total of 227 subscribers. Everything is more expensive in this country. Now, this tariff would likely hurt both economies, but would likely hurt the Canadian one significantly more. Because this is the second or third largest trade relationship in the world, depending on the month or year, and border cities in both countries would likely experience economic turmoil. But these tariffs might have some truth behind them, because the joke that Trump brought up at the dinner was essentially saying, well, if your country can't survive stealing $100 billion from the USA every year, you could always become the 51st state. Now, I find that horribly offensive because the Canadian government doesn't steal from other countries ever. They only steal from Canadian young people's future hopes and dreams. Get it right. But all of this got me thinking about what would be the possible pathway for Canada to become America's 51st state on this sort of trajectory. Now, I just want to say I'm not for this. In fact, the only countries I think Canada should unite with are Greece, as someone with a Greek family ancestry, the former British Caribbean islands, which might actually happen eventually, but that's another story, and my own personal idea, which is Vatican City annexes Canada. The Pope wakes up one day, decides to annex Canada, calling it God's backyard. Tim Hortons becomes the new communion bread supplier, and the Vatican begins rebuilding the Roman Empire in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Oh, one can dream. But getting back to the real topic, how would the United States annex Canada, and what would happen afterwards? Well, Trump's joke was saying that if Canada got into a large enough trade deficit and the economy got bad enough, that would lead to Canada becoming a part of the United States. But has something like this ever happened? One country becoming a part of another country just because of the economy? Well, strangely enough, the United States has done this. A lot. Hawaii, if you don't know, was once an independent nation called the Kingdom of Hawaii. But the Americans couldn't have an entire independent kingdom so close to their borders in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Coincidentally or not, the United States introduced the McKinley Tariff, a 50% tariff on all imported goods. Hawaii, because it was so reliant on the bald eagle's trade economy, soon went through an economic crisis, and many of the business owners in Hawaii began to try to get Hawaii annexed into the United States. And after a good old American-led military coup and some one-sided negotiations, Hawaii happily joined the United States under their own free will, even though the vast majority of native Hawaiians were against it. Huh, well, that's weird. How did Hawaii, a country where the people didn't want to join the USA, eventually have its representatives vote to become a part of the USA? Nothing malicious to see here, folks. Let's move right along. Texas joined the United States in 1845, with a large reason being wanting the United States to take on all of Texas's national debt. And arguably my favorite example of one country joining another country for economic reasons is actually Scotland joining the United Kingdom. You want to know how that happened? If you've seen Braveheart, the most historically accurate movie of all time, you would have seen Scottish fighting for their independence, laying down their lives for a shot at freedom from the English. And eventually, Scotland, led by Robert the Bruce, became free in the 1320s. And they were free for nearly 400 years. But do you know how they ended up being annexed by the English again? Well, Scotland in the year 1698 put the equivalent of 20% of the country's GDP towards trying to colonize Panama. And because Scottish people aren't exactly the best equipped to live in the jungle, amongst other reasons, the colony failed. So they cut their losses, they tried to build up their homeland economy, and lived happily ever after as an independent kingdom, except they didn't do any of that, and they tried to recolonize Panama again immediately after it failed. And what do you know? The second attempt failed as well. Thousands of Scottish people died. Virtually all of Scotland's economy was placed in the hands of this colony, and so, once it failed twice, Scotland became bankrupt. So they went up to the English and said, hey, sorry to bother you guys, but can we join you so that you can take on all of our debt from our failed colonies? And that is why we have the United Kingdom today. So there are a few examples of nations joining other nations because of economic reasons. But what would this look like for Canada joining the United States? Well, the vast majority of Canadians do not want to become a part of America. However, there is a scenario where things could get so dire where it could be considered. Over 75% of Canada's exports go to the United States, so a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods can theoretically straight up just send Canada into a recession immediately. And not only just a recession, but a recession that is actually recognized by the Canadian government. Not like the one that Canada is actually going through right now, that the government is calling a vibe session. Gotta love politicians. Canada, because of policies of the Emperor, amongst other reasons, has also already seen almost $1 trillion of businesses and investors flee the country to the United States to try to find greener pastures. So maybe this tariff goes even further and makes investors leave the country at an even faster rate. The oil sector is one of the largest sources of government funding in Canada, and a large reason is because it exports a ton of its oil to the United States. With these new tariffs, maybe Canada's backbone of its government funding goes away, and Canada does enter some sort of debt crisis. Maybe the economy crashes because of all of these things, and people lose their jobs. People can no longer pay their mortgages, and there's a housing crash. What did I just say? A housing crash? Nah, housing prices will never crash. All the other economic downturns can happen that I mentioned already. But the government of Canada would rather see Canada literally burn to the ground than have housing prices drop even 1%. Now, as we know, when economic conditions get harsh enough, separatist and annexation movements can begin to rise. Now, I still don't think that a full annexation movement will happen in Canada, but walk with me here. Let's say unemployment keeps rising in Canada and hits 15%, a wild number. Housing prices will probably continue to skyrocket in this scenario. Inflation rises, wages stay stagnant, and people can no longer afford to live. If this were you, and you know that another country could save you and your family from this predicament, would you join them? Well, many individuals would say yes. And well, lucky for Canada, you have the peaceful freedom-fighting liberators to your south that would be more than happy to alleviate your debt and boost your economy at the small price of losing your culture, your dignity, and your freedom. But now, let's just say that this annexation eventually happens. Some referendum happens, Canada votes to become the 51st state of America, and America swallows up another portion of its manifest destiny. What would this new addition to America look like? Well, immediately, America gains something that they look at like Gollum looks at the One Ring, and that is oil. You see, the United States is already the largest producer of oil in the world, but adding Canada to that, which is already an oil superpower in itself, would be like giving prime Shaquille O'Neal Steph Curry's three-point shot. It would be in such an overpowering position on the energy stage that it would be able to throw around its energy weight even more than it already does. And because the United States has significantly less restrictions around oil and gas, you can bet that any American oil oil baron would be licking their chops at getting a sweet, sweet taste of vastly expanding Alberta's oil sands and eventually getting into the Arctic oil reserves. Another thing that would happen is that Canada would have to convert to the genius American imperial measurement system. Because why use the metric system where everything is divisible by 10, when instead of saying 1,000 meters are in a kilometer, you can say there are 1,630 yards in a mile? But you know what? That number isn't correct because there's 2,120 yards in a mile. Wait, that's not correct either. Or is it? No one knows, not even Americans. That's my point. Other things that would likely happen would be Canadian companies being bought out by American ones. That's because for the first time in their lives, Canadian companies like Rogers and Bell would actually have this thing called, competition. And they would be vastly unprepared for that, in my opinion, so they would probably just give it all up to some US telecom giant. The healthcare system in Canada would disappear, and it would adopt the American system, which is beloved by all Americans, so Canadians wouldn't complain about it at all, is my guess. America would be adding a state with the population size of California and the GDP of New York. That in itself would make America even more economically dominant on the world stage, and keep China at bay from surpassing the United States economy for a few more decades. The United States would take control over all of Canada's military assets, including the enlisted Canadian Navy sailboat that was built in 1921. Although my brain kind of came up with this funny image of the Canadian Navy sailboat sailing beside one of America's warships like the USS Gerald R. Ford, a ship that's pretty much a skyscraper on the water. But anyways, the American military-industrial complex would probably be quite happy because it would have a lot more border to patrol, and would likely get to build more ships and planes in the name of American hegemony, self-defense. Canada is also home to a lot of resources that America doesn't have, like lithium, cobalt, nickel, and many others, meaning that America could now become almost fully self-sufficient for a lot of its resource needs. However, one thing that a lot of pro-annexation Americans may not realize is that centrist Canadians and many conservatives in Canada are actually nowhere near as right-wing as most Republicans, meaning they'd pretty much be importing tens of millions of likely Democratic voters or independent voters by annexing Canada. And we all know that Republicans are totally okay with importing left-wing voters for elections. They have never said that this was an issue, ever. And one thing that I always find funny here in Canada is that we as a country care so much about China's small influence on our elections, Russian influence as well. Yet by far, the biggest foreign influence in our elections is the United States. If you account for the United States' cultural influence or just monetary influence on Canada and our business leaders and our politicians, American influence on Canada and its elections is almost incalculably bigger than any other foreign nation. Yet, no one here cares about that. But the real reason why I think the United States would annex Canada is not for economic or geopolitical reasons. No. I think it's because they want to create the most dominant sports nation in the history of the world. Imagine combining the Canadian and United States hockey teams, basketball teams, or Olympic squads. It would be the greatest sporting nation on earth that would dominate everything. Except for, that most popular sport in the world, where they kick the ball around with their feet for 90 minutes just to have the game end 0-0 with like 4 shots on net. What a great sport. Regardless, a Canadian annexation into the United States seems unlikely. However, you never know. Maybe Canada tries to start their own colonial scheme and tries to colonize Panama themselves. Or maybe Canada blows a bunch of money on useless expenditures for over a decade, which brings the country to a fiscal cliff and an economic downfall that the country has never experienced before. Yeah, that won't happen. But whatever may come, here's hoping that if the small chance of Canada being annexed into the United States happens, that it is peaceful, it promotes unity, and that Canada rises up to reclaim the rightful territory of the American Empire from within. Okay, see ya, bye.